You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Film sales are down and most of the processing labs I used to patronize are long gone, and it's understandable. Digital cameras and the pictures they take keep getting better and better. What's interesting is that there are also a growing number of photographers who've been tinkering with imaging technologies that predate film, some dating back to the earliest days of photography. These processes include platinum printing, daguerreotypes, calotypes, tintypes, bromoil, carbon, cyanotypes, gun bichromate, palladium, and others. This is a world in which you are an active participant every step of the way. There's no such thing as automatic or program mode when it comes to alternative process photography. Today, John Harrison and I have two guests in our studio. Geoffrey Berliner is the executive director of the Penumbra Foundation and the Center for Alternative Photography, a nonprofit organization dedicated to photographic arts and education. Jeff also owns what has to be the largest collection of old-school brass lenses on the planet, and he can tell you the history and serial number of each and every one of them. John and I recently spent a few hours at the Penumbra Foundation. The moment you step through the doors, you're immediately taken back in time. Steampunk is an appropriate word to describe the atmosphere, and everywhere you look, people are working with tools and techniques that defy the march of time, and you can taste the passion. Also joining us today is photographer Jolene Lupo, who actively works with many of these processes. We'll talk to her about her work. She's also into spirit photography, which I guarantee you we will touch upon later in the show. Before we start, just a reminder, we appreciate all the buzz and feedback from you guys, our listeners. So tweet us at BHPhotoVideo with hashtag BHPhotoPodcast. Welcome, everybody. Jeff, let's start off. What's the mission of the Penumbra Foundation? What's the story here?
The mission is to maintain the relevancy of early and historical photographic processes, and we basically say it's the maintaining the art and science of photography with the idea that it can be applied in various different ways. As you mentioned, the digital marches on. There are fewer photo labs around. There is film disappearing. But of late, there's been a resurgence in film. And one major thing we do is to maintain the ability for artists who want to work in analog to be able to do it if film disappears. So that's one major part of it. The other part of it is that as digital continues, the medium of digital, I call it flattening. It's one particular medium that everybody has to sort of fit into that medium. It's sort of constricting. It's sharp. It's saturated. Most of the work is done outside of camera. It's done after capture. It's done in Photoshop, Lightroom, and other types of digital manipulation. And that doesn't suit every artist or photographer. So the idea is to maintain and present the ability for photographers to have other processes other than digital. The other part of what we do is to maintain these processes for educational purposes. So even if you're a digital photographer, you want to be a better digital photographer, you have to understand the fundamentals of photography itself. So you understand what shadow is, what light is, what f-stop is, how to manipulate a captured image on film so that when you understand those aspects of photography, they can be applied when you're using a digital camera. So it's an educational tool as well. And I do feel that it informs all types of photography. If you learn the historical photographic processes from Daguerre all the way through traditional film, that only helps you be a better photographer no matter what medium or what kind of equipment you use.
And I know you guys offer workshops and classes, but do you offer classes in, let's call it in roll film photography, 35 millimeter, or is it just straight alternative processes?
No, we teach film. Film is becoming more and more popular amongst younger folk. They're picking up old cameras at flea markets on eBay, 35 millimeter, Canon, Nikon. We have a guy in our building, Frank Rubio, the camera doctor. I'd like to give him a plug because he does incredible work. He fixes everything from a 35 millimeter camera. He does digital sensor cleaning. He does large format. And
we saw his workshop. It's incredible.
He used to be at Lens and Repro, which is unfortunately another wonderful establishment that's gone.
So tell us a little bit about how the foundation got up and running.
Penumbra was founded about 10 to 12 years ago by a man named Eric Taubman, and he ran and owned several photo labs for the better part of 30 years. and he had an interest in alternative photographic processes and history of photography. His wife is a well-known wet plate collodion photographer named Joni Sternbach. She does a wonderful series of surfers in tintype, and she travels around the world. I first studied wet plate collodion with her. She was teaching a workshop at the ICP. I took that workshop with her about 10 years ago, and I was bitten by the bug. I just had to continue. And that was a time, that was like sort of the early mid 2000s, and digital photography was becoming so prevalent that people were really throwing away their cameras. I remember having, Nikons and Canons, and, they were literally throwing them away. You can almost pick them up out of the dumpster.
What would you say gave you the bug? What was it about it that caught you? And were you then a photographer? Had you gone digital at that point, or
I had been a photographer. I had digital cameras primarily for documenting things. If I was putting something on eBay, I didn't take digital photography that seriously. I really enjoyed analog photography, film, and I was getting more and more into large format. I liked the idea of having control over my composition, having movements, being more technical in my approach to composition, and correcting the image from the camera. I also like the idea that the larger the negative you got, the more resolution you got. I also was collecting early photographic lenses, and I wanted to use those lenses for the formats that they were meant. And at that time, people were throwing away lenses. I remember, I think I went on eBay and, around 2002 or 2001, and there were 5 huge brass lenses. And I think I paid $100 for the 5 of them. And I was even wondering, did I pay too much for these at that time? But when you get these lenses in your hand, you start looking at the history, you look at the kinds of images that were made with these, you say, wow, I would like to do that. I was very interested in the pictorialist movement, photosecession movement. Soft focus lenses were used for those types of images. And I wanted to try that. And I wanted to actually use those lenses for the processes and the formats they were meant to use. So that's when I started taking wet plate collodion workshops and other photographs. I took a Calotype, which is a paper negative workshop. That's William Henry Fox Talbot's original process. So I wanted to learn these processes, and they really informed me. They helped me understand photography. They slowed me down. They made me think about what I was taking a picture of and what my composition, what my subject was. I just want to point out the reason I was so smitten by wet plate collodion photography is because as a New Yorker, I like immediacy. People think that some of these processes take a long time. It takes a long time to learn it, but once you get up to speed, you can pop out a tintype in 10, 15 minutes. It's like a Polaroid. It's like instant gratification. It's like an addiction. It's like you just want to, make more. Do another one. And
it's interesting to hear 15 minutes being quick turnaround at a time when people look at their LCD, and if the image doesn't come out in 4 seconds or 3 seconds, they get impatient and trade in for the next camera.
Right.
So.
It's all, the leading up to it. Yeah, it's all relative, and it's referred to now as the Polaroid of the 19th century. I mean, it really means that you can go in there and you can set up your subject. You have enough time to work with your subject, or if you're doing it in the field, you have an idea of what you want to photograph, and then you pour your plate, you sensitize it, you take it out, you develop it, you stop it, wash it, and then you have an image you can look at. And that's pretty instant if you want to, make changes right then and there. With film, digital is a whole nother thing, but with film, you have to shoot it, you have to develop it, you have to then contact it, you have to look at it, dodge and burn, all this stuff. So there's a much longer process involved. But to get back to Eric, Eric was very interested in sharing his love and his interest in early photographic processes. So we started teaching workshops and having workshops, and he would invite especially artists working in those processes. And that's a very important distinction to make. There are many people teaching these processes who learn them online, or they don't do the entire process. And he was interested in finding artists who are using it for their own work and did them in a historical way. So they learned how a platinum print would have been made by Stieglitz, and they then used the appropriate materials, chemicals. For instance, Carl Weiss, who is our platinum printer and instructor, he teaches the workshop teaching people how to develop their negative for platinum, which has a huge dynamic range. So there are a lot of very blacks, very whites, and he teaches how to develop, how to expose and develop a negative using pyro, which was the original processing chemicals, so that you maintain detail across the entire range. And unless you understand how to expose the negative and how to process the negative, you're not going to take advantage of the complete range and the beauty of the platinum print. And that's how we teach all of our processes. We want people to have the historical context. We want people to understand that this is how it was done in the 19th century. And then you can then go yourself with that knowledge. And if you want to modify it, adapt it for your own particular work, you can do that.
So a lot of the things that you're talking about are actually is parallel to contemporary photography. Today we have the option of putting it onto program or automatic or whatever, or just touch the button and take a picture and somehow it comes out perfectly. But if you're really learning photography, even with a brand new camera, you put it onto manual, you do have control of shutter speeds, you do have f-stops, you do have all of these controls, and once you learn how to do those, it's the same principles as working cameras from 150 years ago.
Photography is photography. I mean, just on that point, the basic photographic principles still apply to digital photography.
Something I'm curious about, again, John and I walked through your facility 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and it was a terrific experience. It's easy to imagine, especially if you haven't been there and just listening to what we're talking about right now, that anybody who goes into your facility, who participates, who's into this stuff, is walking around in Victoria garb with big wooden tripods and cameras,
right,
and they can't take a picture without putting a black cloth over their head. I would imagine the reality is different. What percentage of the people who participate, who come to your foundation to learn these processes, are actually using contemporary cameras, be them digital or film, and then outputting their imagery using these old techniques as opposed to people who are again, coding their own everything?
That's a good question. And I think the one distinction I want to make between us and other institutions that teach this who really want to do it by the book, and they really want to go back in time, and the Civil War reenactors were some of the first people who brought back Wet-Collodion photography because they would have a wagon on their Civil War reenactment field. So they would have a guy making tintypes of the soldiers, and they want everything to be as accurate as possible. We're more interested in supporting artists working in these processes. So most of the people that we advise in terms of equipment, I recommend new equipment and inexpensive equipment. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get set up. You don't need to buy a 19th century lens for $1,000 or $2,000. You can find a Magic Lantern pencil portrait lens, which is the same kind of lens used for a Magic Lantern or projector. Put it on a speed graphic, and that whole kit can cost you under $750. You can, once you understand how you're using a lens cap so your shutter doesn't have to work, you can get an inexpensive tripod. You can get a Majestic tripod for $50 or $100. The chemistry doesn't cost a lot of money. So we advise people, and there's a company called Chamonix, which they make wonderful cameras, but they also make a wet plate holder that actually just needs to be modified a little bit with a little bit of spar urethane on the inside, but that's ready to go, basically out of the box, and that's like $115. So for $1,000 in total, you can be up and going. You can build a dark box out of a cardboard box and just get a cloth to put over it, and you can do it very inexpensively. There are some people who really fetishize their equipment, and I'm not going to say I'm not one of them because I love equipment. Don't get me wrong.
We've been to those back rooms.
But my interest in equipment is not only the thing and the object; it's the history, it's the development, it's understanding the formulas and the development of the photographic lens.
Of the interest that you have, how much is history? And how much is photography? Is it fair to separate? Can you make that distinction?
Yeah. I think and I'll use this term a certain way, but if you're a thinking photographer, they're intertwined. You cannot separate the two. If you're interested in photography, and if you're interested in anything, I guess you can, any subject you're interested in, to understand it fully, you have to understand the history of it.
Well, for whatever it's worth, I mean, I know a lot of people who are technical geeks, and their technique is amazing, and their pictures are boring. You actually do take very, very good portraits and photographs, very much. So I could vouch for that.
I have to leave it up to other people whether my images are good or not. I enjoy doing it, and whether you're a good photographer or not is really not in one person's own hands. But I do use my lenses, and people say, "Why do you have so many?" Well, I think. Jolene will attest that when we need a lens for a particular job or a project or a format or a particular look, I have every one.
They're paintbrushes.
They're paintbrushes.
It depends on what kind of stroke you need on that particular.
It's a very good analogy because if you look at an artist, a painter, they have hundreds, if not thousands, of paintbrushes, and each one does something
different. And that's not because they're too lazy to clean them off. Each one has a particular need, and that's what a lens is.
Can we talk a bit more about what Penumbra has to offer? I know there's workshops. I know you have the Tintype Studio.
So Penumbra is a photographic arts and education organization. We support artists working in these processes, and we teach those interested in these processes for various reasons, everything from those interested in just learning the process from a historical perspective. We just had a Daguerreotype workshop this past weekend with a guy named Mike Robinson. He's probably the best practitioner or technician of the Daguerreotype process using the mercury vapor process. And many conservators will take our workshops, especially if they want to understand how to conserve and preserve photographic images and to identify them. They have to know the process and understand it. So there's that. There are artists who want to learn the process to use them because they have a particular vision. And you never know which process is going to work with what particular artist. Perfect example is Sally Mann. Sally Mann does wet plate collodion photography. And that's a perfect combination of somebody who has a unique vision, and that process really suits her vision perfectly. And we have people who actually teach. Morgan Post, actually the wonderful photographer, one of our instructors, he teaches digital negative so that you can take with the right approach and profiles, you can take a piece of acetate and print digitally onto that the size that you want, and then contact print it. And the technology has gotten to a point where those digital negatives are really quite dense and a beautiful tonal range and gradation in tone. So there's a digital aspect to what we do as well. We have a wonderful library program. Eric and the organization has a huge collection of early photographic manuals.
Yeah,
perhaps
those are impressive.
perhaps the largest.
That's the most impressive wall of photography books I've seen.
Yeah, and they're not. I mean, there are some monographs, but they're mostly early photographic manuals. And for the most part, history of photography has ignored those because they're difficult. Who wants to look through technical manuals? Well, those interested in history of photography, if you really want to understand, I mean, I call history, but history of photography basically a jigsaw puzzle with infinite pieces. And these particular books and manuals help fill in some of those pieces and help us understand the history of photography from that. I mean, the history of photography is not only art history and images that were made, but art and science. They have to come together.
Yeah.
And then we also have a lecture series. We have a wonderful program coordinator who came to us from the ICP, Leandro Bijaro, who puts together this wonderful lecture series, 7 to 10 artists every semester, emerging artists and those who are mid-career.
All working in alternative processes?
Mostly alternative processes. We don't limit it to that, but sometimes they use digital, sometimes they use large cameras, sometimes they use film. We also have the Tintype Studio is a wonderful program. It's actually a studio, actually walking like a Matthew Brady style studio.
Mm-hmm. It's a trip to walk by the window and look in. That's how I discovered your place. I was over at LTR and I happened to be walking out. I looked in the window and go, what is this? I thought it was one of those little pop-up installations you find around Midtown where, for 1 week somebody sets up some obscure look. No, this is the real deal.
How'd you get the name?
Penumbra is we started at the Center for Alternative Photography, which is, a pretty fitting name, but there are other organizations called that. And that was for when we were for-profit, just workshops. But when we became a nonprofit organization, Eric said, I think we need something that really expresses more than just teaching workshops. And he always loved the term penumbra. Penumbra is an astronomical phenomenon that's essentially an eclipse that shows great light and great shadow at the same time. And that's what photography is, shadow and light. We chose the term foundation because a foundation is an organization that gives away money. And most nonprofit organizations don't give away. They may be nonprofit. They don't have any shareholders. The profits don't sift up. But a foundation gives away money. And I felt that it was important that we give. So giving away a free education, doing outreach, and outreach in other ways. We have some free workshops, especially for kids at Photoville and places like that. But eventually the BFA MFA program is the idea of giving away a free education. And I mean a very top-level education from early photography all the way through digital. The kids that come through our program, I want to have a better education they can get in any school. And it's really based on my grandfather went to Cooper Union, and he got a free education. He was a photographer for the New York Times. And I wanted to sort of maintain that legacy and have a free education. Great. So one important program we have at Penumbra is the Artist in Residency program. It was put together by Leandro Bijaro, who is our programs coordinator. And essentially, we've been raising funds. We're having an auction, which will be online within the next month or two. And please take a look. And many very well-known artists have sent in their work to support this program. And basically, we're going to have, starting with 2 artists who will apply for this program, who will be supported with funding and using our facilities. And they'll also teach and have a lecture in a way to support, especially young artists, emerging artists who need help to get their work out there. And also have a place to do their work in New York City. So please take a look at
an artist in residency program.
It's called an artist in residency program. Okay. The idea moving forward is to have 6 artists a year, each doing about 6 weeks. for that program. So that's important. The education I mentioned, moving forward, we're going to be doing more outreach.
This is a great growth period for Penumbra.
Great
right now.
growth period.
It sounds like it. I mean, on all fronts.
And one more thing worth mentioning is that we have wonderful studio spaces that are rented commercially and that Penumbra gets to use as well. It's called Highlight Studios. And we have a North Light studio. We actually cut the roof of our building off facing north, and we built a 20-foot bank of windows with non-UV glass so that you can do alternative processes. I think it's the only type available commercially North Light studio that can be rented for photography. A lot of food photography use it, commercial photographers,
And what's
fashion
the
photographers.
advantage of the North Light?
North light is the most diffused, beautiful light that you can get because it's facing north. The sun is behind you, so it's not strong spectral light. And it's the longest arc of the sun during the day. So you have the longest light possible, and you have the most diffused, beautiful light. So all the original Daguerreotype studios, Tintype Studios in New York along 3rd Avenue, along the Bowery, Broadway, were all these wonderful North Light studios.
Rooftop North Light Studios are the big deal, the beginning of photography. in
Exactly.
Manhattan.
And we
every
have
rooftop.
one. And we have one. So it's wonderful to have that available.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. and we come back, we're going to talk with Jolene and find out more about her and her work.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, #BHPhotoPodcast.
We are back. Okay, Jolene, in addition to running the Tintype Studio over at the foundation, what kind of photography do you do? How'd you get into it? When was the first time you looked at a photograph or a camera and said, ooh, I want one, I need to?
Well, now I work in a variety of processes, everything from Wet-Collodion to digital. And for me, I'm not so much dedicated to any one process as much as I'm really trying to find the right process for the type of style that I'm trying to achieve. Very inspired by spiritualism, spirit photography from the 1860s, and a very cinematic way of storytelling.
Your pictures are they're very, very cinematic in that
Thank
sense.
you.
It looks like you're doing a little stage play or something like that. What got you into spirit photography?
Well, I actually found a book called The Strange Case of William Mumbler, Spirit Photographer.
Okay.
And this goes back into the history of spirit photography a little bit. So it was really a large movement in the 1860s. And you have to imagine it was at a time when people didn't really understand photography fully, but they knew that it could see more than the human eye could. X-ray photography was starting. Also, the Civil War had just happened. People lost a lot of loved ones. And this wave of spiritualism was really sweeping the country. You know, all of a sudden, people were having seances in their houses. There were rappings being heard. And this one photographer in particular in Boston says he doesn't know how it started, but the spirits just started appearing in his images. So he started marketing himself as a spirit photographer. And he made a killing. He even had Mary Todd Lincoln with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln appear in
I've
one of
seen
the
that photo.
photos.
Sure.
And so it was really creating a phenomenon. And a lot of people were trying to prove that this was fraud. He wasn't doing what he said he was. And it actually ended up coming to a trial in 1869 where they were saying, you know, you're not... you're giving somebody something, you know, that's a little fraudulent. And they actually listed out 9 ways that he could have done this. Now, you know, it's easy to look at these photos and think maybe it's just double exposure,
Right.
you know,
Oh, yeah.
things like that. But the best part is that they couldn't prove how he did it. So he gets off. And in the end, it doesn't really matter how he did it. It's all about this slick kind of sleight of hand. And you have, and it's
Snake
also
oil.
snake
Visual
oil. Yeah.
snake oil.
Before the age of the internet. I mean,
Okay.
he's really proving to these people that, or, you know, or he's really getting people to believe that loved ones are appearing in these photos. You know, I think there's something really magical about that. My first foray into spirit photography was actually using high-speed photography. And it was a seance scene with actually a bursting water balloon in the middle that was...
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so... and it kind of evolved from there. I think very early on, I was really inspired by the aesthetic look of these processes and the formal qualities without even realizing what I was referencing. And the more that I delved into the history of photography and really started looking into what process looked like what, the more I started thinking about working in them and moving my work more in that direction.
So are you working tongue-in-cheek?
Yes, of course.
Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I'm very much interested in the sleight of hand. I think a lot of photography involves that, whether or not it's for spirit photography or not. You know, I mean, look at the advertising photos you see from McDonald's, for instance. I mean, it's everywhere.
So let me ask you, has anybody ever looked at your photographs and actually approached you about trying to reach?
Yes.
Really? Now, how do you handle that?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to handle that because I really love, I love two different qualities of the spirit photographs. I love the symbolism that's in them. I love those early photos where people really feel hopeful that they're seeing this loved one and this, spiritual connection, this exploration of spirituality. But I also love the campiness in them. I also pull a lot of inspiration from like B horror movies from the 1950s. And the next project that I plan on doing is actually a little bit of a separation from the Wet-Collodion work. And I'm actually trying to do more of a black and white series, kind of very cinematic, pulling inspiration from these old campy, black and white movies, but also from kind of like whodunit movies and really staging a large kind of production.
And her equipment gets larger and larger, and the lights get bigger and bigger. I just want to point out that, photography is magic in a sense. And what Jolene is doing is she's actually photographed magicians, and her work deals with this idea of magic. So there's sort of interplay between photography as magic and her work being magic. And Jolene is so good at it that she's actually teaching a workshop now at Penumbra on spirit photography.
This coming October.
And do you shoot the photos at the Tintype Studio?
Yeah.
That's what you do?
Yeah, we actually have also even had a spirit photography night in the Tintype Studio. We usually do some kind of themed programming around Halloween. Definitely stay tuned because I've got some things planned for this year.
I subscribe to your newsletter, so I'm going to be watching for these things.
Definitely. And there's a great quote that I read in one of these books that says, it's the photographer that establishes the relationship between technology and the occult with a sleight of hand and a parlor trick that is made in the name of levity. And I feel like that really is an overarching theme in my work and what I strive to do with it.
We're talking about all of these ancient techniques and things that go back that are archaic and historic. It's worth mentioning that both Jeff and Jolene have taken out their phones and taken pictures during the course of this.
Of course.
So we are talking about one thing, but at the same in the background, everyone's hamming it up with their phones. So
I think if Daguerre had a cell phone, he'd be using it.
Oh, these spirit photographers would be using every tool at hand,
Absolutely.
and especially in the Tintype Studio, we're really merging new and old technology. I mean, we're doing this process from the 1850s, but merging it with modern lighting. I mean, we're using pro photos in the studio and use digital quite often. I mean, everything from digital negatives to photo docking the images to go on the internet later. I mean, if we're not using the digital tools that we have at hand, I mean, we're really just kind of doing a disservice to ourselves, I think, in this day and age, And
I think it's fair to say that digital access, and let's call it the revolution for a simple term, has brought an interest to some of these old processes,
Yes.
no? I mean, isn't that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that one of the best qualities, or one of the things that draws a lot of people to the tintype is the tactile quality of it.
Yes.
I mean, it's a physical object, and it's something that is going to outlive all of us here. And, I've once heard somebody say, who wants to inherit Granny's hard drive?
Right.
It's so true. I mean, what are we going to give to our
there
children?
There won't be anything left on it. It'll deteriorate. On that exact point, it is tactile, and there's also this idea that the hand is in these images. You actually see the craft involved, and there's a process by which, and there's a learning process by which you're constantly improving and building on what you learned before. I'm not saying that's not true in digital, but there's something wonderfully contemplative about going into the darkroom and working with your process and being with yourself and being in your thoughts, which is a very different experience than sitting in front of a computer.
How does that differ, though, from just, from 35 millimeter and silver nitrate, darkroom work? Is there something that you can kind of point to that really distinguishes the process? Each process has its own particularities. That's number one. So I think 35 millimeter, medium format, and any kind of film process has its own particularity that people are engaging in and learning and building on in that process.
You say film. Film is a generic term, okay, but shooting with a 35 millimeter camera is different than shooting from a medium format or 4x5 or 1620.
Yeah.
Right.
They have the different process and different look.
Absolutely.
And they're all film.
They're all film.
I feel like a person's temperament comes into this a lot too, especially with wet plate.
Yes.
I mean, the people that I think excel at it the most are really little type A OCD, but
Yes.
also prone to creative problem solving.
Or the opposite. Sometimes they're the complete opposite. You know?
Yeah.
But just on,
it's all there again. It comes like we mentioned brushes before. These are all tools.
yes.
And they all have their different effects.
Right.
And again, I think one of the neat things, and I think it's something that people will take a digital camera or only their phone, and they think that this is all I need to do images. Yes, you can do a lot with each one of these tools, but the more tools that you use, be they cameras, be they lenses, be they processes, it adds more into your familiarity with the overall craft and gives you more things to reach into, to borrow from, to apply, so that even
Right.
if you're shooting digitally, if
You have a greater palette. You have a greater palette.
Exactly.
Let me use
you're
that
able to apply
as
that.
from there, Jolene. How would you approach, let's say, one subject and choose one process compared to another? Can you give us an example?
Sure. So recently I did a few photos, promotional images for a mentalist, magician, if you will. He was actually going to be recreating a Victorian seance in October. And so we shot it on glass negative. There is such a rich history of the spirit photos shot in this process. And I ended up printing them out as albumin prints, hoping to make them into cabinet cards in the end. I think it's a really nice way of kind of giving this sort of historical tie-in, this
Yes.
kind of takeaway, like the tie-in with the
Yeah, you're
card
adding
to
a dramatic, a 19th century dramatic element to what is really a dramatic event. The cabinet card was basically the iPhone of the day. People would pass them around. There was no TV. There was no radio. They would share images with each other of historical figures, famous people, and the cabinet card. Some of them were very elaborate. They had gold. Depending on how much money you had, how much you wanted to spend, they had gold edges, gilding.
And it's a great way of really mixing text and image, so you could really kind of title the person's name, have the photo, give a little bit of information of, what it's for. But yeah, I find, for me, the most successful work really marries the process and the concept. I think, for the magician work, the albumin prints were kind of an obvious tie-in with that.
And why would that be?
Oh, just because of the history, it's sort of a modern way of reinventing something that people have done before, through more of a contemporary lens.
Okay.
And also tying in the sleight of hand through the shooting with also the sleight of hand that he does in his performances.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to point out there are many people who practice these processes because they enjoy doing it. They're not particularly making art. They enjoy doing that's fine. I think, what Penumbra is and what I'm interested in is really supporting artists and their vision.
I think there are a lot of people that come in and ask us, can't you just put a filter on this? I mean, between me and you,
Well, you can,
is there really a difference? And by the time
I
you
got to
lead,
get back to work, right? Type of thing. Yeah.
but by the time you lead them through, what the process is, you put one in their hand, they're ready to book a session. I mean, it really is a special thing. And I think you also kind of have to see it and feel it to completely understand it. It a little bit is lost in the digital representation of some of these prints and the tintype process and all of that.
And it is an experience. And the one thing I want to point out that everybody who's at Penumbra, everybody who's there loves being there. They love doing their work. I encourage them to do their own work. And when they teach, they're sharing what they love with other people. It's just not dialed in. It's not by the book. There's a lot of collaboration, even with the students. Sometimes students bring in a particular way of thinking. It really is a wonderful place to learn. It's an environment that is really built around learning and sharing of knowledge information.
Okay, we're going to take another short break. We come back, we're going to talk about the different alternative processes.
If you'd like to reach out to us with your questions or comments, email us at podcast@bhphoto.com.
Okay, we are back. Let's talk about some of the processes. Could you go down in some order? Let's start with the ones that you handled down at Penumbra.
Well, we handled just about every historical process, starting with Daguerreotype. As I mentioned earlier, we taught a Daguerreotype workshop with Mike Robinson, and that was the Mercury process. That was the original process that Daguerre offered to the world.
Now, correct me if
for
I'm
free.
wrong. Daguerreotypes actually never dry. They remain a liquid suspension, correct?
Well, they're not quite liquid. They're vape.
Vapor, yes.
It's vapor interacting with silver. So the Daguerreotype is a clad piece of copper with a very highly polished piece of silver on top of it, which is like a mirror. And then that that piece of metal is sensitized with bromine and iodine, which are salts, or types of salts, which are attaching to the silver and sensitizing the plate. It is then put into a camera and developed. The exposures were very long. I think sometimes, 20 seconds to a minute, depending, or more, depending on the light source and how much you stop down the lens. And then you take it out of the camera and you would develop it using vaporized mercury that is at about 135 degrees Fahrenheit. And that vaporized mercury, which is in a vapor form, not a liquid form, is developing the plate. It takes about 12 minutes, 8 to 12 minutes. And then you have and then once you remove it from the heat, it's no longer vaporized, it's in a dry form. You then put it on a special stand, and you put gold chloride liquid on it to both bring up the contrast and seal it so that it's archival, and then it's put behind glass. So
it's pretty easy.
Yeah, it's a very it's one of the most difficult processes, but it still yields one of the sharpest. It's like ASA1.
I've been told that might be amongst the sharpest images that you can get. It's grainless.
It is. It's almost grainless, but it's like ASA1, and below, So wonderful images, and these images survive to this day, and they're incredibly sharp, and the tonal range is beautiful, and they have this, wonderful image. It's called an image object. They have a wonderful quality to them. They're like an artifact that you hold in your hand. They're really magnificent.
They're also monochrome, but some people added colored tints to them.
They did.
But that's not that was on top of it, so it's a whole art.
There's actually supposedly a color process of the daguerreotype that a guy, I think it was Octavius Hill, I think was his name. I think he developed a colored daguerreotype that till to this day they haven't figured out how he did it, supposedly. But Calotype is the other. So 1839, both of these processes were invented at the same year. William Henry Fox Talbot was a paper negative, and you would put silver nitrate basically on a piece of paper, and then you would develop that. You shoot it in camera, develop it. Also a very difficult process, but you can make reproductions on salted paper or albumin paper to get direct positive contact prints, and that was the precursor to film. He did not offer that to the world for free. It was patented and licensed, and you had to pay him. So what was going to proliferate was the daguerreotype, because all you had to do is get the equipment, then you can practice it without paying a licensing fee. The next process, Wet-Collodion, Frederick Scott Archer, I believe that was 1852. There was actually development up to that point, but Wet-Collodion democratized photography. It was much less expensive to make a tintype than a daguerreotype, so it meant that just about anybody, like Billy the Kid, could have his tintype made. It was used during the Civil War. There were 3 expressions of it. There was the tintype, which was on a piece of metal, actually iron. It's called ferrotype originally. It was never originally on tin. The theory is that people used tin snips to cut the plates to put them in the box. That's where tintype came from. There were, just about anybody can walk into a studio. These studios proliferated, and you can make a tintype. You can make an ambrotype, which is a tintype on glass, and then you would paint the black. So that was a positive, and a glass negative, which Julia Margaret Cameron and Nadar and other photographers of the period would use. They would make carte de visite, which are the 4 lens, 4 cards. Lincoln was photographed that way, and then you can print that and make 4 cards or 4 images on one with salted paper or albumin using that glass plate negative. So those are the 3 expressions of Wet-Collodion. And then as time went on, you had dry collodion for a little while, a couple of years. That didn't last long. The dynamic range and the contrast was not very good. And then dry plate, which is basically a film emulsion, which is a suspension of silver gelatin, silver in the gelatin, which meant that you can take it out dry instead of taking all your camera and doing it wet. And that was a precursor to film. It eventually went on roll film with Kodak and the Brownies, and it was also necessary to have it on celluloid or something flexible to put into a movie camera. You can't put glass through a movie camera. And then there were a few other processes like autochrome, which was a black and white color process, and then of course film, traditional film. And there was orthographic film, which didn't have the complete dynamic range of panchromatic. So orthochromatic and then panchromatic. So panchromatic, everything was,
I just have this image of a listener sitting there scribbling away frantically as you're going through.
Well, if I were to, walk into Penumbra to start, where would I start? What would be the first process that a newbie would jump on?
I would obviously say wet plate Collodion photography. I mean, it's hands-on. I mean, it's not everybody's cup of tea, but, the thing about wet plate Collodion, you can learn how to make a negative and make a tintype.
You're starting from scratch there too. You're taking the basic materials and you're coating the papers, you're sensitizing them. So this is all hands on. It's not like we
Right.
give you $10 and you pull 3 sheets out of a box. And
Right.
give it to us.
No, you
Right.
make, Go
and
ahead.
in that way, it's not reliant at all on film companies continuing to make film or large corporations. I mean, you're making the whole thing from scratch, and there's something really beautiful about that.
Absolutely.
It's like cooking.
And what cameras would you use for that?
Well, I think, like Geoffrey was saying before, I think it's a common misconception that you need these old cameras to do this process. You really can shoot with just about any camera you can put a fast lens on and stick a plate into. And we actually offer a workshop where we teach people how to modify existing 35 millimeter and medium format cameras to hold tintypes. I mean, we shoot with a Nikon 35, make these little plates for
105,
jewelry.
2.5.
They're tiny 24 by 36.
We call them
millimeter.
tiny types.
Tiny types. Or medium format. I mean, there's
Any large format camera you have,
speed graphic, crown
you can
graphic.
make your van into a camera.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, somebody did
But
that.
what do
Yes.
you guys? What is what is the best for you guys? Not the best.
Well,
and
best,
I know
I mean-
that's a bad word to use in this situation, especially. But what would you
Well,
guys use if you had to choose?
Well, I just want to point out that people can get very inventive, and there's a lot of modification, and it's endless the camera, their equipment, and we really encourage people to use the equipment they have. You don't got to spend a lot of money, and be innovative. You can actually make a wet plate holder out of a film holder.
Yeah, not to get
by
held
cutting
up
it out.
on the equipment too
Right.
much,
I have every lens you can possibly imagine. We use fast lens. I have lenses that the kind of lens that Julie Margaret Cameron would have used. They're Dallmeyer lenses. I have ones that are very fast, f2.2, that are about 200 millimeters. I like to use the lens that was meant for that format. I like flattering perspective. I like shallow depth of field. But you can use, a Tessar. You can use a modern lens, Simar.
Are there
Wonderful lenses for
any
wet plate.
processes that we can't do nowadays that are lost or?
It's called instant film, Polaroid, and
Not
Fuji.
true. Impossible.
And Fuji.
Impossible is
I
here.
do like
Peel
Impossible,
apart.
and they're getting better. I do like their film. I wish they would make a peel apart, but I know they didn't get the equipment, and I think that's the problem. There's also Fuji Instax, which is a film because they're not making a Fuji.
I used to do
instant anymore.
Polaroid transfer prints,
Yes,
which were
they're wonderful.
lovely.
Yeah.
They were beautiful.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of them at home.
Yeah, I think
And they're lasting.
Yeah, we actually have a workshop called Chemigram where we actually are just making cameraless. That's a printing out process where you're taking chemicals and putting them on photographic paper, and you're getting these wonderful different kinds of expressions just with the chemicals on the paper. Then, of course, Lomography is an organization which I love because they're still making lens. They made a pencil portrait lens. They have this Achromate lens, which is the first lens used for Daguerreotype camera, the Chevalier Achromate lens. They're still making and selling analog cameras. They are still selling film. So they're also keeping analog alive as well. And there are some processes. There's really not any process that we don't teach. There are printing out processes like platinum printing, cyanotype, Van Dyke, Daguerreotype, which is a process we brought back. And then there are capture, and there's brome oil, but you actually use different types of inks, using brushes and different kinds of techniques to bring out that print. Gum bichromate, a gum over platinum. So all these printing out processes, and then there are capture processes like Daguerreotype and wet plate collodion and traditional
Calotype.
film, Calotype. Or capture processes, and they can be, you can do a calotype and then print it as a salted paper, or you can print it as a platinum print, and so on and so forth.
You're also doing something. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think when you're just getting started, it's also important to do a little bit of research before the class and look into the accessibility of doing this process outside of the class.
Yeah.
Because when I first got started, I wasn't sure if I wanted to dive in and do the Daguerreotype class over wet plate collodion and just go all the way. And I'm so happy that I didn't, because I'm not sure how much I would have moved on with it after. It's just, when am I going to set up a mercury fuming pod in my apartment, but I can set up a portable dark
this
box
is some
for
of the
wet
things
plate.
I wanted to get at. I mean, so there are things that you can do in your home
Yes.
Yeah,
without
and these processes, they can be restrictive in some ways. I mean, you definitely, when you're doing this long term, you want to be weary of the safety involved in them, and ventilation, I think, is the biggest
Ventilation,
issue.
very important.
People who shot daguerreotypes, did any of them be like older than 27, 28
Well,
years
I don't know how they
Usually
lasted
the-
at all.
Those are nasty.
The Mad Hatter comes to mind.
Yeah,
because
exactly,
they use
yes.
mercury. Mercury was used in vaporized form for various things, for gold plating, for making hats. And a lot of those people went insane, because they were exposed to this and they didn't take the proper.
When
they
they
didn't
say
realize.
mad as a hatter, it's quite literal.
It's
because
quite literal.
people
They
used to
went
clean
insane,
hats
right.
went nuts at an early age from
Right.
the chemicals.
I just want to point out that when we teach our workshops, we teach chemical safety. All of our facilities have correct ventilation. We have a fuming hood for the daguerreotype process.
It's all very obvious there too. Yeah, I noticed as soon as I walked through, I realized you guys are taking everything.
Right.
You have to.
And not only do we take precaution, but we also teach people chemical safety and how to handle chemicals so that when they go and do it themselves, they understand the hazard of these chemicals.
Yeah.
There are some people we do not teach potassium cyanide for the fixer for the wet plate collodion process in the building for insurance reasons. Some people want to use it. I tell them, is it worth the risk to maybe killing yourself for the slight warmth and a little more dynamic range that you get from it? Well,
Absolutely.
Some people think it is.
Absolutely, yes.
Do it on your own, but learn the right way to use it and wear gloves. We always tell people to wear gloves, wear a mask, have proper ventilation, and really understand and look at these chemicals and what the dangers are before you start.
Be realistic.
Be realistic.
Yeah. But be realistic and then do it safely and then you can have great things.
And that's another part of the learning process.
Yeah, I think it's great to start with a workshop as well.
Yes.
You know, when you start trying to teach yourself a lot of these things, I think that's one of the big elements that kind of gets pushed to the side a little bit,
Well, yeah, people learn on YouTube. They're not taught chemical safety. I get emails and messages from Facebook all the time. How do I do that? What chemistry do I say, you know what? Take a workshop. There's reason we teach them. We teach chemical safety. We teach where to get the chemicals. We teach how to handle the chemicals, how to store them. They shouldn't be stored together. They have to be stored a certain way in a particular place in a certain temperature. Do not open your ether in your basement with your pilot light on your boiler because ether goes it's less
very flammable.
It's very flammable. It's heavier than air. It'll find that pilot light and it'll blow up your house. So these are.
An interesting thing, though, is that when we went through your facility, you showed us a camera setup that you had. It had 4 lenses and I think 6 or 9 lenses.
Right.
And you're doing tintypes, capturing 4 or 6 or however many little successive images on one thing. And you come, and the ultimate output is a GIF that's animated.
Right, that's Jolene. That's all. Well,
that is so, and I think it's really important to know that this is a perfect example of, you're taking something from 100-something years ago, and you're outputting this wonderful little visual that is today. And you're blending
it's
all
that
of
perfect
these
mixture
things.
of old and new, I think.
And it makes you smile and laugh, and it's wonderful.
That's a wonderful expression of collaboration and working with creative people. I got the camera. I set it up primarily so we can do 4 different exposures like a photo booth. And then when Jolene said that, I said, wow.
She took it to the next.
Of course. I said,
Yes.
How wonderful is that? And then she takes it and she puts it on Instagram and you can actually see.
So you've got 30 years, 3 decades of experience, maybe more, Ball said, and she comes in and within X amount of short period of time, all right, she's saying, hey, let's take it here.
And Geoffrey had also taken it to the next level with the shutters that he put on the front. I mean, in the beginning, people would not get their photograph taken often. You get 4 of them and you give one to mom and one to grandma, and it was just a means of making more. But Geoffrey made little shutters in front of each lens, so you can do each one individually, sort of photo booth style, and it kind of evolved through playing around with that.
I mean, we all got a chuckle at it. That's what I'm going back to have done. I love it.
Can I ask you quickly about taking your Big Bertha to Yankee Stadium?
Yeah.
First, describe, because you have to paint a picture.
I just mentioned Alan worked at PhotoCare many years ago, and there was a Big Bertha in the window, and Jeff Hirsch, who's a wonderful guy, said, "Can I buy that camera?" He said, "No."
He said the same thing to me, for whatever it's worth.
Right. And I understand because, the magnificent cameras, but I didn't even know if it worked. But, recently a friend of mine who repaired these cameras passed away, and his estate contacted me and said, are you interested in these cameras? And I said, absolutely. And I purchased them. They were very nice to me. They didn't rake me over the coals on the cost, and I couldn't afford too much anyway. But I wanted to do justice. One of the cameras was this Big Bertha. It's a 5x7 Graflex. It's a single lens reflex camera that was modified by a company called James Fritzolini, who used to work for a newspaper, so that they would take these long aerial lenses that were no longer in use after World War II.
Long meaning like 4 or 5 feet long, and about what's the diameter of this thing?
The diameter is probably 6 inches or more, and it's a 1,000 millimeter lens, which is equivalent to a 200 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter camera. And they mounted it on there with actually separate. You can actually adjust the stop, so you can have quick focus for first base, second base, pitcher's mound. And so when I got the camera, the first thing I did was I took it out of its, basically its coffin.
You took it out of its coffin.
Coffin.
Pretty much.
And I said, I actually had the tripod that it was meant to go with already that I had purchased many years ago. And I set it up, and the shutter was a little sluggish, but it worked. And I adjusted it, and I did some work on it. And I said, wow, it works. And I have a friend who works at the New York Yankees, Jim Petrozello, and he is the Yankee photographer. And I said, we've been trying to do a project with the Yankees. At some point, nothing really worked out. And then he presented this to Yankee management and said, yeah, let's do it. So on opening day, we brought the Big Bertha with 100 sheets of 5x7 film to the press pit at Yankee Stadium on the field, and I got to shoot opening day with it. And the latest New York Yankees, the May issue of Yankees Magazine, has those images in it. So I wish everybody take a look at it. And I learned a great deal about.
You got a great picture. There's one shot that was just outstanding. You really pulled it off.
Thank you. It was a little bit of a learning curve, but and I was watching all the digital photographers sitting there waiting for the shot, and they just hit a button and they did a burst of 100 shots. I had to get one shot, and then I had to learn how to use it. And I really learned how to use that camera, and I got a real feel for how they used it back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And I'm glad I brought it back to life, and I'm glad I did justice to the person.
I'm just wondering, when you tripped the shutter, did a cloud of dust go up in left field? It's a big thing to go up and down.
It's a ka-chunka. It's like the sound of
smell comes out of it.
Exactly, the sound of one shutter clapping. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, as usual, we can go on forever with this, but time has a way of bringing things to a conclusion. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, John and Jason, our producers. This has been a wonderful show. Check out Penumbra at penumbrafoundation.org, and check out Jolene's work at jolenelupo.com. And please don't forget, give us your opinions on Twitter at BHPhotoVideo with the hashtag BHPhotoPodcast, and rate and leave a review on iTunes. My name is Alan Weitz. Thank you so much for joining us today.